Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Pages to Progress. We are journeying through the book, Emotionally Healthy Spirituality. I do this every single time. John, could you please show your book, please? Because mine's not showing. Emotionally Healthy Spirituality by Peter Scazzero. I'm here with Dee, John, and Joe. Thanks very much for joining us. Whatever time you are watching this, thanks for joining us on the journey. Today, we are reviewing chapter 4, Journey Through the Wall. If you are just joining us for this project and you want to know a little bit more about what we have been doing, we take books and we critically analyze them, and we bring our Christianity, our Adventism as a lens to these books, and we agree, disagree, and grow from these books as well. So you're very much invited to join the journey. You can click the link below in the description box and you'll be able to access the Amazon link to get the book or follow along with us. Today, chapter 4, Journey Through the Wall. We're going to try and reflect on our thoughts as we have gone through this book. Okay, so this chapter seems to really just focus on specific, I want to call them blocks, using the same word as wall, I guess. So they focus on specific things that take place in apparently everyone's life, upon which they inhabit a serious sense of negative emotions that cause people to really rethink their lives. I think that's what's the idea of what he's trying to describe with the wall. I think he makes a distinction at some point that these aren't simple trials that we go through, but major stuff that takes place in our life that brings across transformation. Does anyone want to add to that definition that I've possibly done quite bad?
That's interesting you mentioned that, because near the end of the book, where did I write it? I literally wrote, "Who defines a wall?"
Oh, okay.
Yeah, at the end of page 107.
Right.
Under that section, how long will this take? Presumably getting through the wall.
Right.
He tells a story about, where he tells a church member that he has hit rock bottom, and the church member laughs at him, and she says, "You have no idea how much farther you have to go."
Right.
And so I thought, I don't know. It's interesting.
Yeah.
Who defines a wall? A wall for one person is nothing for another. And vice versa, and I think maybe that goes back to what God says, you'll not be tempted beyond what you can handle. So anyway, that's just my thought.
Yeah, I got that sense too. You don't have to share, but does anyone here resonate with the idea of some kind of major war that has maybe taken place in their life, which have caused them to radically shift their possibly theological picture of God, personal idea of who they are as in terms of their identity? Does anyone feel that they've met this so-called wall that Scazzero is talking about? Okay, maybe the silence speaks for it.
Well, based on this reading, I put the definition of wall as crisis of faith. I think somewhere on page 100, I think that's how he defined it, or at least that's how I understood it. Crisis of faith.
Yes.
And personally, for me, I have not had experience of crisis of faith.
Okay.
Yeah. But I, like 2-3 years before I turned age 40, I really took a good look at myself, my inner self, and I told myself that there's still a lot about me that needed to be changed for the better. And I didn't want to be hitting my 40 without having gone through that change, having become a better person. So I started praying about it. And yeah, I think Yeah, I was basically seriously praying just a simple prayer of God, help me to become a better person, help me to become more like you in my character. That was just a simple that prayer that went on for, like I said, I started that journey like 2-3 years before. But I would not call that a wall.
Fair enough. And one of the
Yeah.
distinctions that he makes on page 103, as he further describes the idea of a wall, by one of the ancients in theology called the dark night of the soul, he lists a few things or feelings that are linked to that. I am bewildered. I don't know what God is doing right now. I am hurt. I am angry. Yes, this is mystery. I'm very sad right now. Oh God, why have you forsaken me? It sounds like from what you're describing, Dee, that wouldn't be fair to describe your feelings for what you were going through. It's more, you were simply trying to be more dedicated to the pursuit of Christ, right?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, fair enough.
Oh, I can speak to walls. I don't like the word wall. I don't know why. Maybe it's just political.
Maybe we recently have an idea of what walls mean from a political sense.
Keep something out.
Sure.
But so when he says wall, I immediately interpret it as desert experience is what I would call it. That ends up being transformational. And I think you see that happen with Christ. He enters the ministry, he gets baptized, and he immediately goes to the desert and comes out a different person. I mean, he's still God, but he's ready for his ministry. I'm not sure he would have been otherwise, although, you know, who am I to say? So I think I've had these experiences, and it's interesting because they correspond with leaving a comfort zone and going somewhere else. So when I left high school, went to college, was the first time I actually ever read Ellen White, and I started the Conflict of the Ages series. And I wondered, and it was transformational for me. I haven't read a lot of the other Ellen White stuff, mainly because Ellen White had been used up until that point to tell me what I can and can't do.
Right.
You know, and it not just, it wasn't my parents at all. It was the little old ladies in the church, honestly. It's just like, you can't wear shorts in church. You know, you can't grow your hair out long. And it's just like, what's that have to do with anything? And Desire of Ages, the Conflict of Ages series, and specifically Desire of Ages. I mean, I went through the whole series, and, you know, it's just like, what's wrong with this? It's expounding on the Bible, and it gives some depth to everything. So that was one experience. The other experience was leaving medical school and going to residency in New York, because that was the first time, you know, college is the first time I'd left home. New York was the first time my wife and I had been that far away from home. And I mean, we went to New York, so that's about as far away from Portland, Oregon as you can get. And we literally had, you know, an adjustment to make with that, but we also had to make that decision that I think any relatively newly married couple has to make. And that is, are we still going to go to church?
Right.
And if so, is it going to be the Adventist church? And if so, why? And, you know, it was, I checked out a bunch of different things. I got back into my Bible, and for whatever reason, it reinforced what I was as an Adventist. And to some degree, it was, I couldn't find anything that was better than being an Adventist. And I do have some problems with the Adventist church on several different levels. It's not, you know, too earth-shaking for anyone. But even with those problems, we were able to resolve that we were going to continue to go to church, and we have. But, you know, we did before we had kids, and we continue to do it after we had kids.
Those are pretty life-forming and life-changing decisions that you had to make, though. Regardless of, you may not have had most of the feelings that I read out on that page. You might have had a few, but sounds pretty defining to me that you would even make those decisions as a result of those things. Joe, do you have a similar experience? If we don't have to call it a wall, a desert, a mountain, a thing that has radically shifted or transformed you as a Christian?
Yeah, I think I've mentioned this in previous other books, you know, my own personal experience that I know that maybe, John, you didn't experience, or maybe other people haven't experienced. And mine wasn't really earth-shattering either, but it was still my own personal experience where I kind of, it happened in college, right? I was doing my own thing. I left the church. I think I told you, quit praying to God for about a year. And then during that time, I really felt like I hit rock bottom, and I came out of that, when I reached out to God, and God kind of, in a sense, kind of redeemed me, or I kind of rededicated my life to God. And that was my college years. And I would say that's my turning point. So that's my own personal experience. But so I like the idea that we can talk about, where was that turning point in one's life, where you're in the world and finally you're coming back to God, the prodigal son story, right? I think we can all relate to that he had the wall moment, or he had his, dark moment, when he was, in amongst the pigs. And that's a story in the parable in the story of the Bible, right? That prodigal goes out, he finds himself, all the money spent, he finds himself with pigs, and he finally makes an aha moment and he goes back to God, right? That's his experience. But I think all Christians, if we really are, calling ourselves Christians, you think, well, when is that moment? It should be, for the most part, the baptism, right? We live a certain life, we find God, we repent, we dedicate our lives, and we commit ourselves to God. And so we go under the grave, which is the water, we come back alive, a new person. That should be this, this renewness of life, right? Other people have a more, personal experience, outside of the baptism, like I know that I had. He goes, my baptism when I was 13 wasn't this, aha moment. It was like, oh, I went through the motion like everybody else. But for me, it was in college. And I will share with you, after we get along a few minutes here, why I don't necessarily like the way that maybe the author kind of presents this in a different language, a very Christian idea, right? I just shared with you the baptism, the prodigal story, repentance. I don't like the way he necessarily described it in the language he used. And I can talk about that in just a minute.
Okay. Well, why don't you set us off, Joe? Why don't you help us out by telling us, and then we can respond as we continue to reflect.
Sure.
I knew Joe wasn't going to like this chapter.
Well, I like I said, I'm definitely being open-minded to what he has to say, but I still have perhaps some issues with who his references come from, and who he uses to support his ideas, and where these ideas ultimately come from. And yeah, I have to dig deep, and I'm sure all of us are, but I have to dig deeper to find out where he's coming with all these ideas. And I'll just tell you from my first stop, it was in the first paragraph. He says, every follower of Jesus, the first paragraph in chapter 4, every follower of Jesus at some point will confront the wall. And then it says, as the ancients, and he's referring to the mystics, the Catholics, the Tao, his references, as the ancients called it, the dark night of the soul. And if you're really interested, I would encourage you to Google that. Google the dark night of the soul, and you'll actually find a really wealth of, I think, information. And I'll tell you what it is. The dark night of the soul is a catchphrase, actually, in the Roman Catholic spirituality, and it describes a spiritual crisis. Now, that in itself isn't what I have an issue with, right? It's almost what they say, it's the spiritual depression, this quote existential crisis. And they kind of analogy that they use is like a cocoon, right? Where a butterfly goes in, sits there in his darkness, and then comes out of it reborn as something totally different, right? And that is actually a very it's a very spiritual, and this dark place is what the spiritualists call the dark night of the soul. And so when I say spiritualists, there's a group of people that are not necessarily Christians. It may be the Catholic, Taoist. It may be, but there's a group of spiritualists, and Eckhart is one that he, maybe references. And it is something where I think you kind of have to go into this darkness and then come out a reborn someone as someone different, an enlightened person. Whether it's nirvana or something else, people use those different languages. But as you go through this chapter, I do see where he's taken us, at least midway through the chapter and at the end. He says, all Christians have to go through this. They cannot have a good Christian life unless they go through this wall. And the only way to get to this wall is them, this introspective inward approach. And this is kind of where I think the emotionality, healthy spirituality, this contemplative spirituality, where you need to figure out where there's this hurt underneath. You have to dig deep into this darkness, search deep in this quietness. And then when you come out of that, you'll be reborn into something different. It's a very, if you, again, in every single one of them, I went through this whole chapter, all the references he referenced in every one of his quotes was actually a Catholic, monk or someone in the Catholic world who's very much connected with the spiritual world. So that's why I had my little issues with that. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. Fair enough.
On page 101, the third full paragraph, he says, for most of us, the wall appears through a crisis that turns our world upside down. So honestly, I don't think he's getting as deep as you are on this, Joe, because then he says it comes perhaps to a divorce, a job loss, a death, a cancer diagnosis, a disillusioning church experience, betrayal, a shattered dream, a wayward child, a car accident, an inability to get pregnant, a deep desire to marry that's unfulfilled, a dryness or loss of joy in our relationship with God. I mean, and so then this brings me to my problem with this book, I have problems on several different levels, but with this chapter, I was unhappy with, and it's partly because of what Joe say. I mean, he implies that everyone has to go through the wall or you aren't a real Christian. Well, that's just plain and simple not true. Some people get through life a lot easier than other people, whether they're Christian or whether they're not Christian. So that's one thing. The other thing is, the book, when I first got it and looked at it, was kind of billed as a discipleship course, it is, textbook.
Yeah.
And it's not, at least up until now. It's a self-help book. And what he's done, he's a pastor, so everything in his world revolves around the spiritual, presumably. I don't know the guy. And so everything that's happened in his life has to have a spiritual twist to it. And so, the worst thing that's happened to him was his wife leaving his church, and then him and his wife having a disagreement, and then him having an unsatisfying church experience. And that's his wall. And I'm just kind of like, okay. I'm just, and you wrote a book and you set up a course, and it's not any different than any other self-help book so far, except that he's got a spiritual twist on it. And you look at the chapter titles, and I think that's part of the problem Joe has, is that it's very introspective, to use a politically correct word. But, he kind of defines the problem, and then it's like, know yourself, and then you'll know God better. And, you got to, wrestle with your past, and you'll come out better once you, wrestle with your past. And then, you're going to have low moments, the wall, and you got to get through, and you'll be a better person once you get through. So.
Okay, so thanks for getting on your soapbox, guys. I appreciate that. No, I seriously do, because it helps.
I took it and I looked at the rest of the titles, and I'm just kind of like, where are we going with this? And chapter 6, honestly, has piqued my interest. And that's why, it's discover the rhythms of the daily office and Sabbath.
Sure.
And I'm just curious what he has to say about the Sabbath, but the bar has been lowered quite significantly, and I'm not holding out.
And that's fine, because everyone's entitled to have their own reactions to this. And I get why there are some areas upon which we set ourselves back because of our associations with authors and organizations and other churches and the Catholic Church, etc., etc. I get those. I think the run of the thread of what he's trying to draw through this chapter, at least, is that there are really tough times that he assumes comes to every single Christian. And I think he wants to provide a roadmap that enables you to come out as a stronger Christian on the other side. I recognize the reality that his experience might weigh thin as we look at our own experiences. Does the child need to touch the hot pot for the child to learn? Probably not all the time. If the parent is continually guiding and leading the child, maybe not does the child learn more when they do touch the hot pot? Some could argue, yes, they do. I certainly would share that there has been many experiences in my own life where I've had radical shifts and transformation in my faith and in my personal life, where I have needed the translator, I'm going to call the Holy Spirit the translator, to be able to decipher what is going on and how God is speaking me through those experiences. I could add to the many things that I also don't like about this chapter, but I won't. I'm going to add one thing that I do like, and maybe to offer some kind of balance, and that is on page 104, towards the end, where he says, while in chapter 2, I talked about the critical importance of paying attention to our feelings in order to know God, the dark night, and again, I understand where this comes from, but I think he doesn't go as deep to try and guide us into mysticism, but as an analogy to describe really transformative, difficult times that we face. The dark night protects us from worshiping them as in our feelings. This is one of the more common idolatries of the spiritual life. So here's the thing I do like, and the thing that I feel is inconsistent in some levels. I do like the reality of how he points out we need to be careful in our introspection not to allow them to become governing idols of our lives. I don't like the reality that there is a sense of him, I guess so, spiritualizing things that don't necessarily need to be spiritualized. There are some times in our lives where our feelings are just our feelings, and God may or may not use them in those moments to guide us, if that makes any sense, what I'm trying to say.
Oh, absolutely.
And I think it's important to know that those tensions exist. I struggled through the notion of trying to work out, does every Christian need this wall? I wondered to myself if that is the case. I certainly have found that to be true in my life, but Dee's mentioned that she probably doesn't see it that way and hasn't experienced it. And maybe Scazzero would probably argue against Dee and say, it's coming, Dee, just wait and see. I'm sure.
I'm talking about the wall as defined as being crisis of faith.
Right. And could it be argued that we all face those crises in our life? Maybe, yes, we do. At some point, we do. Wondering if we can shift to the latter part of the chapter. In the latter part of the chapter, from like 108 onwards, he talks about characteristics of what we achieve on the other side of this so-called crisis wall, so to speak. And he lists a few things that was quite interesting. So I'm going to pick out one thing that I thought was interesting to me, and you guys can feel free to pick out another thing. I thought it was interesting when he talked about a greater appreciation for the holy unknowing or the mystery. Now, I understand that could cause some tension, especially when we think about his background of quoting different authors from mysticism. But I think what he was talking about was the idea of having a sense of fear for God, fear for God, of the mystery of really not knowing sometimes how he's leading and what he is doing. Because I'll be frank and say, there are areas in my life where I know that God is leading. And then there are areas in my life which I have no idea. There are areas where I translate things that happen into my life as blessings. And there are areas that I translate them as curses or anti-blessings, whatever we want to use. Can we be sure of those instances? Not all the time, but we can be sure of God's leading in those instances. And there is this kind of holy space of recognizing that we can appreciate the mystery of God in our lives. So those are my initial thoughts on that aspect of that section. Was there anything else that pointed out for you guys in the latter part?
Yeah, I think some of my experiences, that number 3, a deeper ability to wait for God. So, I mean, I mentioned spiritual crisis. I've had some, work crises, so to speak, in the past, and some of them led to me actually going from Salt Lake City to Seattle area. and I always kind of have an idea of what I think I want to have happen. And obviously it's with a lot of thought and prayer. And it never seems like God makes things happen as fast as you want him to, is one thing. And he also doesn't ever seem to get things done the way you would do it, but it always ends up being better. And so I've always, not always, I've much more recently become much better at waiting and let God work through his own time and means, instead of me trying to make things happen through just pure force, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, the greatest challenge in Christianity is to wait, I feel. What about you, Dee or Joe? Did anything in the latter part of the chapter interest you?
I think for me too, personally, I think definitely number 3, waiting. You know, that's something that I think I just become more aware of and basically learn to do. You know, and I think part of it is, again, that letting go of the control factor and really choosing to trust God.
When you say trust God, what do you mean by trust God? Trust that he is going to bring about a favorable solution?
No, sometimes it's not a favorable solution. It's not. But trusting in God, meaning that he has this good plan for me, and no matter what it turns out to be, or no matter what it may look like in my eyes or anyone else, I have to choose to believe that ultimately God has a good plan for me. That's what I mean. And the fourth one, I think the detachment, that I'm not quite sure if I would call it a detachment, but I think you come to a place of really having a much deeper understanding, the knowing that you are just this tiny speck in this life, and really you're not that important, and that it really isn't just about you at all. And yeah, there's a lot more important things going on in life than you.
So where I understood that as well, I got that sense. I also got another sense on the opposite end, D, when he spoke about the idea of greater detachment. I'll quote page 114, where he says, "We are to be marked by eternity, free from the dominating power of things." And to me, that actually just highlighted how special I am in the relation that actually God has literally marked off this huge, great plan for me to be a part of, which increases my value. I'm not saying you're to negate what you said. It's just another side of what I felt.
No.
Was
No. When important. I say what I said, I don't mean that I don't feel special or anything like that. Right. I am completely special. I am the apple of God's eye. I know who I am in Christ. But but in the scheme of this world, you know, worldly things and stuff like that. Yeah.
I get that.
I guess what I'm ultimately saying is I don't let these worldly things define who I am, is what I'm saying.
Right.
Yeah.
Amen to that. Joe, if there's any reflections on the last section of that chapter that struck out for you?
Yeah, I'd like, like the rest of us, we, the deeper ability to wait for God, and then he shares the examples of Abraham, Moses, David, and Hannah. And I think each one of those, we could say, yeah, I wish we all could have those kind of life. I wish I could be like an Abraham or Moses or David or Hannah, and have that pure, dependence on God. But each of them had their own, I guess, wall to go through, right? Whether it's Abraham in the struggle with Ishmael and maybe with Isaac, Moses in his 40 years of in the wilderness, David in his fleeing from Saul, Hannah pleading to God for her baby. I think each one of us have this kind of deep, pain and sorrow. And if we allow God to be in that deep sorrow and allow him to carry us through it, oftentimes we feel like we got to go through that pain and sorrow ourselves, versus if you look at each one of those situations, it was, dependence purely on God, walk through the storm with God. And then at the end, kind of being reborn into this new person, right? Abraham, who had such strong faith, Moses, who could lead, the millions, David, who could be the king that God wanted and be a heart after God's soul, and then Hannah be rewarded with a baby. So I think that for me, I could look and say, yeah, have I had, struggles in my life, like the prodigal son? And then did I allow God to work with me? Or do I feel like I have to do it myself? And I would like to think that God invites us to invite him through our struggles. And then, we come forth a much different and better person because of that.
I can't remember exactly what you said, but I thought it was powerful. I'll try and paraphrase. You talked about the idea that we need to invite God into the depth of our pain and sorrow. And I thought that was incredibly powerful to make that distinction. The only reason why I think it's powerful is because many a times when we get to the most difficult moments in our lives, a couple of things happen, and I'll share for me. I pray for God to get me out of it. That's one thing that I do. And the second thing is I assume that this isn't a place where Jesus is, and that this is a place that only the enemy is when difficulties happen. And I don't say that to say that God has orchestrated bad things into my life. I want to be clear with that. I want to be clear in saying that God is using the chaos that happens in my life in order to guide me to a greater sense of my discipleship to him. And I love the idea of inviting God into my pain, because it is the only way that I can get a full sense of navigating through it. And in many instances, when I've gone through really, really difficult times, it's almost a knee-jerk reaction to not do that, because I want to try and fix it, solve it, get out of it, move away from it. But I think that's a very biblical picture of what Christ is inviting us to do, to help us get through these so-called instances. Well, he terms it as a war. We might differ on how we identify them. I think that go on, Dee.
Well, I was going to say, for me personally, I find that God is already there, but I do agree with Joe that I like the idea of actually being actively inviting God into your pain and sorrow, because I think what that does for you is that it increases your awareness, it increases your I guess working together with God to go through that journey.
Right. Yeah, definitely. And I think we should probably wrap things up there. I think that's a good point to end. This has been Pages to Progress. We're on chapter 4, moving on to chapter 5 next week. I am appreciative. Thank you, John. I'm appreciative of the fact that we can all come together and not just smile and nod at every single word that is offered to us here. Because the reality is we come with our own lenses and our own perspective of Christianity that interacts with this author. The truth is, this author goes out to many people to read. And it's really interesting for us to be able to engage and with these authors and offer our thoughts and recognize that God may be saying through something through these chapters, but also to call out the things that might give a bit of tension, to help us to be able to navigate through our own experience with God. So we invite you as listeners and watchers to join us on this journey as we continue to critique, as we continue to grow together. Next week, we're going to be looking at chapter 5, Enlarge Your Soul Through Grief and Loss. And we hope that you can join us on that journey. So until next time, take care and God bless you.